The strange thing about kindness out here is that sometimes it comes back riding harder than a storm. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from tonight. Drop your town or country below. And if you still believe a good man can survive in a bad world, stay with me. Texas, 1878. The wind carried dust low across the street like smoke crawling over the earth. By sundown, the richest banker in the territory would kneel in the mud before a cowboy nobody in town respected enough to offer a warm meal. But that part came later. At noon that same day, Elias Turner rode into Blackwater with a tired gray horse and 30 cents in his coat pocket. The town looked like every other railroad settlement trying too hard to become important. Fresh lumber, new signs, men pretending money made them civilized. Elias tied his horse outside the saloon and stepped through the swinging doors with dust on his boots and 12 miles of road still sitting on his shoulders. Piano music stopped for half a second when folks noticed him. Cowboys noticed everything, especially poor ones. The bartender wiped a glass slow and looked Elias over from hat to spurs. You buying or just warming the floor? A few men laughed into their whiskey. Elias reached into his pocket and set his coins on the counter. Coffee. The bartender stared at the money like it offended him personally. Coffee's 50 cents. Elias glanced down at the 30. Quiet settled around him. Somewhere near the poker tables, somebody snorted. Then water, Elias said. The bartender leaned forward. Water's free for customers. More laughter. Sharp this time. Elias stood there another second, tired eyes steady, before taking his coins back into his palm. He nodded once like he'd heard worse in life, and turned toward the door. Told you. Somebody muttered behind him. Drifter. Outside. The air smelled like horses, wet dirt, and incoming rain. Dark clouds rolled over the hills west of town. Elias loosened his saddle and rubbed the gray horse gently between the eyes. We'll eat tomorrow, he murmured. The horse breathed warm air into his hand. That was when he heard the first scream. Not from a man, from a horse. Elias turned toward Miller Bridge just as lightning cracked across the sky. A black carriage came tearing through the rain too fast for the muddy road. One will hit the edge of the bridge and bounce sideways. The horses panicked instantly. People shouted from storefronts. A woman cried out. Then came the sound nobody forgot afterward, splintering wood over roaring water. The bridge railing snapped. The carriage tipped hard into the river below. For one frozen second, all Blackwater watched the dark water swallow it whole. Then someone screamed, "There's a child inside." Men ran toward the bank, but stopped short when they saw the current. Spring floods had turned the river wild. Thick brown water smashed against rocks and broken timber with enough force to drag a grown steer downstream. Nobody moved. Nobody except Elias Turner. He pulled off his coat before the thunder finished echoing and handed his hat to the stable boy beside him. Hold that for me, he said quietly. Then the poor cowboy stepped into the river while the rest of the town stayed dry. The river hit Elias Turner like winter rolling off a mountain, cold enough to steal breath straight from a man's lungs. The current shoved against his chest while broken pieces of the bridge spun past in the muddy water like driftwood after a storm. Somewhere ahead of him, the black carriage had vanished beneath the surface. Folks gathered along the riverbank shouting directions that meant nothing. Nobody else stepped in. Elias wiped rain from his eyes and pushed deeper into the flood. His boots scraped rock once, then nothing. Water climbed to his neck. A frightened horse thrashed nearby, harness chains rattling under the river like iron ghosts. Then he heard it. A child coughing. Faint. Somewhere beneath the storm. Elias took one long breath and disappeared underwater. The river swallowed all sound at once. No thunder. No shouting. Just darkness and pressure. He reached through the current blindly until his fingers caught fabric. Suspenders. Small shoulders. The boy was trapped against the overturned carriage door, half underwater, terrified and shivering so hard he could barely breathe. Elias wedged one arm against the broken wheel and pulled with everything left in him. For 1 second nothing moved. Then the wood cracked loose and both of them spun hard into the current. The river carried them 30 feet downstream before Elias finally slammed into shallow rocks near the bank. Hands reached out at last. Men dragged the boy free while Elias stayed on one knee in the mud trying to catch air. Rain poured from the brim of his hatless head. Somebody wrapped a blanket around the child. Another man shouted for a doctor. The boy clung weakly to Elias's soaked coat sleeve before they pulled him away. Easy now, Elias said quietly. You are all right. The kid could not have been older than 10. Pale blonde hair, expensive boots, soft hands that had never held a shovel a day in their life. Then came the horses. 6 riders burst through the storm carrying lanterns that bounced gold against the rain. At the center rode a tall man in a dark wool coat worth more than Elias's horse. Charles Whitmore. Even the frightened townspeople stepped aside when they saw him. Bankers in Texas carried more fear than sheriffs sometimes. Whitmore climbed down from his saddle before it fully stopped moving. Noah, he shouted. The boy looked up weakly from the blanket. Father. Relief crossed Whitmore's face so fast, it almost looked painful. He knelt beside his son, checking his hands, his face, his breathing. Then his eyes lifted toward Elias. Slow. Cold. Measuring. Elias stood quietly a few feet away with river water still dripping from his sleeves. One of the riders leaned close to Whitmore and whispered something, probably asking whether the cowboy expected payment. Men with money always assumed kindness came with a price tag hidden underneath it. Whitmore reached into his coat pocket and pulled out several silver dollars. Without standing fully upright, he tossed them into the mud between himself and Elias. The coins landed hard in the dirt with little splashes of rainwater. That should cover your trouble, Whitmore said. Silence spread across the riverbank. A few men smirked behind their collars. Somebody chuckled low under their breath. Elias looked down at the silver lying half buried in mud. Enough money to buy meals for weeks. Enough to replace worn horseshoes. Enough to survive another month. Rain rolled off his face while the storm groaned above the river. But he never bent down. Not even once. He looked at Whitmore with tired gray eyes and said softly, Your boy needed hands, not bargains. Then Elias picked up his wet coat from the ground and walked away through the rain while every man on that riverbank watched him leave. Rain followed Elias Turner clear to the edge of town. Not heavy anymore. Just a cold, steady drizzle that soaked through denim and settled deep into a man's bones. The gray horse lifted its head softly when Elias stepped into the stable with wet boots dragging across old straw. Easy there, Elias whispered, rubbing the animal's neck with stiff fingers. The horse nudged his shoulder once, searching for apples that were not there. Elias managed half a smile. Tomorrow, he said again. Outside, Blackwater slowly returned to life after the storm. Lamps glowed warm behind saloon windows. Piano music started back up like nothing had happened at the river. Men laughed. Glasses clinked. The town had already moved on. Towns usually did. Elias hung his soaked coat beside an empty stall and sat down on an overturned feed bucket. Water dripped from his sleeves onto the dirt floor while thunder rolled somewhere beyond the hills. His hands shook now that the danger was gone. Cold always arrived late after near drowning. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small silver cross he carried everywhere. Tarnished. Scratched. The only thing left from his mother. He stared at it quietly while rain tapped against the stable roof overhead. Still breathing, he murmured. A voice answered from behind him. Barely by the look of you. Elias turned. A young woman stood near the stable entrance holding a lantern beneath her coat to shield the flame from the wind. She wore a dark blue traveling cloak spotted with rainwater, and loose strands of blonde hair clung to her cheeks from the storm. Beautiful in the quiet kind of way that did not ask for attention. Elias recognized her immediately even though they had never spoken. Clara. Whitmore. Charles Whitmore's younger sister. Unlike her brother, she looked at people directly instead of through them. Her eyes moved over the stable slowly. The empty feed sacks. The worn saddle blanket drying near the wall. The cowboy trying hard not to shiver. You should be at home, Elias said softly. Clara stepped closer and held out a folded towel. Clean. White. Probably worth more than everything Elias owned. You saved my nephew, she replied. The least I can do is bring you something dry. Elias looked at the towel, but did not take it right away. Your brother already paid me. Clara glanced down briefly, embarrassed by something she had not done herself. Charles does not always understand people. Elias gave a faint, tired smile at that. Most rich men do not. The lantern light flickered gently between them while rain drummed overhead. Somewhere outside, a train whistle echoed through the dark plains. Clara finally placed the towel beside him anyway. Noah asked about you, she said. Wanted to know the name of the man from the river. Elias looked down at the muddy floorboards. Told him, Elias Turner. She paused. He said he wants to thank you himself. Elias rubbed his rough hands slowly together for warmth. Boy already did. Clara studied him for another moment, almost confused by the simplicity of the answer. Men in Blackwater talked constantly about money, land, cattle, railroads. But this cowboy sat in a freezing stable speaking like none of those things mattered very much. Then hoofbeats thundered past outside. Fast. Urgent. Voices shouted near the center of town. Clara turned toward the stable entrance just as two riders galloped down Main Street, yelling over the storm. "Bridge at Copper Pass is gone," one man shouted. "Whitmore gold shipment disappeared in the collapse." Another voice followed behind him. 20 men stranded in the mountains. The stable fell silent except for the rain. Clara slowly looked back toward Elias. He was already standing. Water still dripped from his coat sleeves. His face had gone still in that dangerous cowboy way that meant his mind was moving faster than his mouth ever would. "Copper Pass?" he asked. Quietly. Clara nodded once. "North Trail. Nearly 40 miles from here." Elias looked toward the darkness beyond the stable doors where cold wind swept across the empty street. Then he reached for his saddle. The storm over Blackwater deepened after midnight. Wind pushed dust and rain together across the empty streets until the whole town sounded like it was breathing through its teeth. Elias Turner tightened the last saddle strap beneath the lantern light while his gray horse shifted nervously against the cold. Copper Pass sat nearly 40 miles north through mountain country most men avoided after sunset, even in good weather. Tonight, nobody with sense would ride there. Clara Whitmore watched him from the stable doorway with concern she tried hard to hide. "You cannot seriously be thinking about going up there alone," she said. Elias slid his rifle into the saddle scabbard without answering immediately. His silence always came first. Words came later. Sometimes not at all. 20 men stranded, he finally said. Maybe more. Clara stepped farther inside, pulling her coat tighter around herself as wind swept through the stable cracks. "The pass is dangerous, even dry. Half those trails disappeared during storms." Elias checked the horse's front hoof gently before standing again. "Then I should leave before they disappear completely." Clara studied him in the flickering lantern glow. Wet hair still rested against his forehead from the river. His coat remained damp around the shoulders. The man had barely escaped drowning himself a few hours earlier, yet something inside him had already decided this ride before anyone asked. "Why?" she asked quietly. Elias paused at that. Outside, thunder rolled low beyond the hills. "Because somebody has to." The simplicity of the answer seemed to unsettle her more than anything else. Most men in Blackwater measured risk against reward, profit against danger. But Elias carried himself like the world still operated on older rules nobody remembered anymore. Before Clara could speak again, hurried footsteps splashed through puddles outside the stable. Charles Whitmore entered with 2 riders behind him, rain dripping from the brim of his expensive black hat. His sharp eyes landed immediately on the packed saddle. "You heading north?" he asked. Elias nodded once. Whitmore looked almost irritated by the answer. The sheriff already sent men. One of the riders shifted awkwardly beside him. "They came back," he admitted quietly. "Trail washed out near the lower ridge." Another man added, "Could not see 10 feet ahead up there." Whitmore removed his gloves slowly while studying Elias. "Do you know Copper Pass?" Some, the banker repeated. Elias reached for the reins. "Enough." Clara noticed the faint scar near Elias's wrist when he adjusted the saddle blanket. Old military scar, not from ranch work. Her eyes narrowed slightly as if piecing together a story he never told aloud. Whitmore stepped closer. "There is $50,000 in payroll gold somewhere beyond that ridge. Railroad wages. If those men do not get paid by Friday, the rail company pulls contracts from Blackwater." Elias listened without expression. Whitmore lowered his voice carefully. "Find the shipment, and there will be $500 waiting for you." The stable went quiet except for rain tapping overhead. $500 could buy land, horses, a future. Most men would have ridden through hell itself for that kind of money. But Elias only rested one hand against the saddle horn and asked, "The driver's still alive?" Whitmore blinked once, almost caught off guard by the question. "Nobody knows." Elias nodded slowly like that answer mattered more than the gold ever could. Clara saw it then. The difference between her brother and the cowboy standing across from him. One measured money first. The other measured lives. Whitmore pulled a silver pocket watch from his coat and snapped it shut with irritation. If you leave now, you might still reach the lower pass before sunrise. Elias mounted the gray horse in one smooth motion despite exhaustion pulling at his shoulders. Wind swept through the stable entrance hard enough to flicker the lantern nearly out. Clara stepped closer to him suddenly and pressed something into his hand. The clean white towel she had brought earlier. The mountains freeze after midnight, she said softly. Elias looked down at the folded cloth for a second before tucking it into his saddlebag carefully, almost respectfully. Then he touched 2 fingers lightly against the brim of his hat. Much obliged, ma'am. No smile. Just quiet sincerity. The kind that stayed with people longer than charm ever did. Outside, the storm swallowed the street whole. Elias turned the horse north toward darkness while the town watched from windows glowing gold behind curtains. One lone rider disappearing into weather no sane man would challenge. And somewhere beyond those mountains, hidden under snow and broken timber, something waited that would change every life in Blackwater before the week was over. The farther Elias Turner rode from Blackwater, the quieter the world became. Rain slowly turned to sleet as the trail climbed north into the mountains. Pine trees leaned hard against the wind, dark and endless beside the narrow path, while cold fog rolled low across the ridges like smoke from some giant unseen fire. The gray horse breathed heavily beneath him now. Every few minutes Elias reached down to pat the animal's neck gently, letting him know they were still together in the storm. Most men talked to horses because they were lonely. Elias talked to them because he understood loyalty better than conversation. By dawn, snow covered the upper trails in thin white layers that cracked softly beneath the horse's hooves. Copper Pass waited somewhere ahead beyond the cliffs and frozen timberline. Elias stopped near a shallow creek to let the horse drink while he studied the mountains quietly. Something felt wrong. Too still. Even the wind sounded careful up here. Then he saw it. Wagon tracks beneath the snow. Fresh enough to notice if a man knew where to look. Elias dismounted slowly and crouched near the frozen ground. For wagons at least. Heavy load from the wheel depth. One set suddenly veered sideways toward the ridge. The rest scattered after it. He touched the track lightly with 2 fingers. Panic, he murmured. The horse lifted its head uneasily as if agreeing. A few yards farther uphill, Elias found torn canvas buried beneath snow beside a broken lantern half filled with ice. Railroad supply markings. Whitmore shipment. He looked toward the higher ridge where fog wrapped around the mountainside thick as wool. Somewhere beyond it sat $50,000 in gold, and perhaps 20 stranded men trying not to freeze to death. Elias stood again, eyes narrowing against the cold. Then came the sound. Faint at first, barely there beneath the wind. A whistle. Not a train whistle. Human. 3 short bursts. Pause. Then 2 more. Elias froze instantly. Army signal code. Old cavalry distress call. His expression changed slightly for the first time since leaving town. Not fear. Recognition. He mounted quickly and guided the horse uphill through narrowing trails where snow climbed nearly to the animal's knees. The storm thickened around them until the world became gray sky and white ground with nothing between. Hours passed that way. Sometimes Elias disappeared completely into fog before emerging again through drifting snow like a ghost riding out of winter itself. Near noon he spotted the first wagon, or what remained of it. The front axle had shattered against a rock slide near the edge of the pass. Crates lay scattered beneath snowdrifts while one frightened mule stood tied nearby trembling from cold exhaustion. Elias slid from the saddle and checked the wagon bed carefully. Empty. No gold. But beside the wheel sat a small metal coffee tin with ashes still warm inside. Somebody had been there recently. He scanned the cliffs above him. Silence. Then another whistle echoed through the storm. Closer this time. Elias reached slowly for the rifle at his saddle, but stopped halfway when he noticed movement through the fog. A boy, maybe 16 years old. Railroad worker by the look of him. Thin coat. Snow covering his shoulders. The kid nearly collapsed stumbling downhill toward Elias. Mister, he gasped through chattering teeth. Please, you gotta help them. Elias caught him before he fell fully into the snow. Easy now, he said. Where are the others? The boy pointed weakly toward the upper ridge. Mine shaft, old silver tunnel. We hid there after the bridge gave way. Elias pulled the white towel Clara had given. him from his saddlebag and wrapped it around the boy's frozen hands tightly. The kid looked down at the clean cloth in confusion, probably wondering why a cowboy traveling alone through a blizzard carried something so fine. "How many alive?" Elias asked. The boy swallowed hard. "Maybe 12 now." Elias looked toward the mountain ridge disappearing inside the storm. 12 men stranded, missing gold, failing weather, and daylight slipping away fast. Then the railroad boy grabbed Elias's sleeve with trembling fingers and whispered words that made the cowboy's face go completely still. "Mister, there is somebody else up there with us." Snow whipped sideways across the mountain as Elias Turner pulled the young railroad worker onto the gray horse behind him. The boy could barely keep his eyes open now. His lips had turned pale from cold and exhaustion, and every breath rattled sharp inside his chest. Elias tightened the blanket around the kid's shoulders before taking the reins again. "Stay awake," he said quietly. "What is your name?" "Ben," the boy whispered. "Ben Harper." Elias nodded once. "All right, Ben. Keep talking." The horse climbed carefully through the narrowing trail while loose snow slid from pine branches overhead. Visibility dropped to barely 20 feet now. The mountains no longer looked like Earth at all, just endless white and black shadows shifting through the storm. Ben coughed weakly behind him. "We thought the bridge would hold." Elias listened without interrupting. "First wagon crossed fine," Ben continued. "Then the ridge gave way. Snow and rock came down from above. Horses panicked. Drivers scattered." His voice trembled harder now, partly from cold, partly from memory. "Some men tried reaching the lower trail. They never came back." Elias glanced toward the cliffs surrounding them. Copper Pass had always been dangerous after storms. One bad sound could send half a mountain sliding. "The others made it to the old mine?" he asked. Ben nodded weakly against his back. "Old Silver Tunnel near the upper ridge. It is abandoned now." Then the boy went quiet for several seconds before speaking again, much softer. "But we were not alone up there." Elias remembered the fear in Ben's eyes when he mentioned it earlier. Not normal fear, not weather fear, something deeper. "Who else?" The boy swallowed hard. "Old man called himself Samuel Grady." Elias frowned slightly. The name stirred something distant in his memory. Ben continued. "He showed up after dark the first night. Came walking through the storm carrying lantern fuel and firewood like he knew the mountains better than the weather itself. Wind howled across the ridge hard enough to shake the saddle beneath them." Elias adjusted the reins carefully. "That scared you?" "No, sir." Ben hesitated. "What scared us was the gold." Elias said nothing. Ben leaned closer, lowering his voice instinctively despite nobody else being near for miles. "Mr. Grady knew exactly where the payroll shipment ended up before any of us told him." Elias's expression tightened slightly. "How?" "That is the strange part. He kept saying the mountain does not hide things forever." The gray horse suddenly stopped moving, ears forward, tense. Elias looked up immediately. Through the fog ahead stood a narrow opening carved into the mountainside beneath hanging icicles and snow-covered timber supports. The old silver mine. Faint orange light flickered somewhere deep inside. Firelight. Elias slid carefully from the saddle and helped Ben down beside him. "Can you walk?" Ben nodded weakly. "Some." Elias tied the horse beneath a pine tree sheltered from the wind and grabbed his saddle lantern. Snow cracked softly beneath his boots as they approached the tunnel entrance together. The air near the mine smelled different. Smoke. Wet stone. Coffee maybe. Human survival. Ben paused before entering, nervous suddenly. The men inside started listening to Grady after the second day, he whispered. "He talks strange sometimes. Like he already knows things before they happen." Elias looked into the darkness of the tunnel. "And the gold." Ben glanced toward the firelight deeper inside. "Nobody has seen it since the avalanche." A long silence settled between them while storm winds moaned across the ridge outside. Then a calm voice echoed from somewhere inside the mine. "You took your time getting here, son." Elias froze instantly. Slow. Still. Every instinct sharpened at once. The voice belonged to an older man. Deep. Steady. Familiar in a way Elias could not immediately explain. Firelight flickered farther inside the tunnel entrance, revealing the faint outline of someone sitting beside the flames waiting for them, like he had known all along they were coming. And for the first time since entering the mountains, Elias Turner felt something colder than the storm crawl quietly down his spine. The fire inside the old silver mine burned low and steady, throwing long shadows across rough stone walls blackened by years of smoke and abandoned labor. Elias Turner stepped deeper into the tunnel beside Ben Harper, while melting snow dripped softly from the ceiling overhead. The warmth hit slowly after hours in the blizzard. 12 exhausted railroad men sat scattered around the fire wrapped in blankets and torn coats, their faces pale from hunger and cold. Every one of them looked up when Elias entered. Hope moved across the room before words did. Then the old man, near the fire, stood carefully from his wooden crate. Samuel Grady looked close to 70, maybe older. Tall once, but bent slightly now beneath years and mountain weather. Gray beard, heavy wool coat patched at both elbows. Eyes sharper than anything else about him. The kind of eyes that missed very little. Elias stopped walking the second he saw them clearly. He knew those eyes. Been a long time, son, Grady said softly. The railroad men glanced between them in confusion. Elias remained still for several seconds before answering. Did not expect to find you alive. Grady smiled faintly at that. Mountains keep old men breathing longer than towns do. Ben looked at Elias carefully now. You know him? Elias removed his gloves slowly, attention never leaving Grady. Long time ago, one of the railroad drivers stepped forward near the fire. Mr. Grady has been keeping us alive 3 days now. Found us after the avalanche. Another man added quietly. Without him, half of us freeze the first night. Elias nodded once toward the old man in silent respect. Then his eyes swept across the tunnel quickly. Anybody hurt bad? A heavy silence answered him. Grady motioned toward the back of the mine, where 2 injured men rested beneath blankets near the wall. Broken ankle. Fever. Nothing a doctor cannot handle if we get them down the mountain soon. Elias crouched beside one of the injured workers, checking his breathing with rough, careful hands. Still alive. Weak though. Outside, the wind howled across the mine entrance like something searching the mountains for souls left behind. Elias stood again. Trail back down. Grady shook his head slowly. Buried under 10 feet of snow by now. The old man tossed another piece of timber into the fire. Sparks climbed briefly into darkness overhead. Storm trapped us proper. One of the younger workers glanced nervously toward the tunnel entrance. What about the payroll shipment? The room quieted instantly at those words. Elias noticed it right away. Men avoiding eye contact. Tension hanging in the air thicker than smoke. Grady looked into the flames before speaking. Gold is still up here somewhere. Somewhere. Elias repeated calmly. Ben stepped closer to Elias now, like he trusted him more than the others. After the avalanche, nobody could find the lead wagon. Another worker muttered bitterly. 30 crates vanished into the mountain. Elias studied the faces around the fire carefully. Fear was there, but something else too. Suspicion. Hunger made men dangerous sometimes. Gold made them worse. Then Grady reached beside his crate and picked up an old dented coffee cup. His hands shook slightly from age as he poured hot black coffee from a kettle near the fire. You still drink it without sugar? He asked Elias. The question caught several men off guard. Too familiar. Too personal. Elias accepted the cup slowly. Still tastes the same. Grady chuckled softly. Everything important usually does. For the first time since entering the mine, some warmth touched Elias's expression. Small. Almost invisible. But real. One of the railroad men frowned. Who exactly are you people? Silence settled again. Fire crackled softly between them. Finally Grady answered without looking up. 20 years ago, this cowboy rode with the 7th Texas Cavalry. Several workers straightened in surprise. Ben looked openly shocked. Elias said nothing. Grady continued stirring his coffee slowly. Best mountain scout I ever trained. Elias stared into the fire now, distant suddenly. Like part of him still stood somewhere far behind in older years beneath different storms. That was another life, he said quietly. Grady nodded once. Maybe. Then the old man lifted his eyes toward Elias again. Calm. Steady. But I reckon that old life is exactly why the mountain let you find us tonight. Outside, something deep in the darkness cracked loud enough to shake snow loose from the tunnel roof. Every man inside froze instantly. Then came another sound. Lower this time. Longer. The mountain moving. The sound rolled through the mountain like distant thunder trapped underground. Snow drifted from the ceiling beams above the mine entrance while every man inside the tunnel held perfectly still listening for the next crack. Elias Turner slowly lifted his eyes toward the darkness outside. He knew that sound. Avalanche pressure. The mountain shifting its weight 1 inch at a time before deciding whether men lived or disappeared beneath it forever. Samuel Grady stood carefully from beside the fire and grabbed an old lantern hanging near the wall. "That ridge has been unstable since the first collapse," he said calmly. "Storm keeps loosening it." One of the railroad workers cursed under his breath. Another tightened his blanket around shaking shoulders. Fear spread fast in cold places. Faster than fire sometimes. Elias stepped toward the mine entrance and stared out into the white storm swallowing the cliffs beyond. Snow blew sideways hard enough to erase the world 10 feet ahead. "How much food left?" he asked without turning around. "Maybe one more day if rationed," somebody answered quietly. Elias nodded once. "Not good. 12 stranded men. Injured workers. Buried trails. Another avalanche waiting above them." The mountain was slowly closing its fist. Grady joined him near the entrance, holding the lantern low against the wind. "You always did know when trouble was coming," the old man murmured. Elias kept his eyes on the ridge ahead. "You taught me." For a moment, neither man spoke. Just 2 old cavalry scouts standing in silence while storm winds screamed through broken mountain passes around them. Then Grady said quietly, "You still carry guilt for what happened at Red Hollow." Elias's jaw tightened slightly. Small movement. Easy to miss unless a man knew him well. That was 20 years ago. Time does not bury everything. Elias looked away toward the storm. Firelight behind them flickered against stone while railroad workers whispered nervously among themselves. Ben Harper sat near the wall wrapped in blankets and watching Elias with growing curiosity now. The cowboy who barely spoke had once been Army cavalry. Mountain scout. A man with ghosts older than Blackwater itself. Another deep crack echoed across the ridge. Louder this time. Snow spilled from the cliff above the mine entrance in soft streams. Elias made his decision instantly. Everybody moves deeper into the tunnel. The workers hesitated. "Now," Elias said firmly. Nobody argued after hearing the tone in his voice. Men grabbed blankets and supplies quickly while Grady helped the injured workers farther inside. Elias remained near the entrance alone for several seconds, studying the mountain carefully. Wind direction, snow weight, tree movement, old habits returning like they never left. Then something caught his eye through the storm below the ridge. Dark shape, half buried beneath drifting snow. Wagon wheel. Elias narrowed his eyes. Not one wagon. 2. Hidden near the collapsed lower trail. The missing payroll shipment. He stepped farther outside despite the wind hammering against him. "Elias," Grady called behind him. "Leave it." But Elias kept staring downhill where snow shifted across the buried wagons like the mountain itself was trying to swallow them whole. If another avalanche came before spring, the gold would disappear forever. So would any chance of saving Blackwater's railroad contracts. Yet Elias barely thought about the money itself. What mattered was the town depending on it. Families, railroad men, store owners, stable boys, even people who laughed at him inside saloons. Storm winds cut through his coat while snow gathered across his shoulders. Then he noticed something else near the buried wagons. Fresh tracks leading away from the snowdrift toward the upper ridge. Elias crouched low beside them. Boots. One man traveling alone sometime within the last few hours. His expression slowly hardened. "Somebody found the gold already," he murmured. Grady stepped beside him, holding the lantern higher. The old scout studied the tracks only a second before his face darkened. "No," he said quietly. "Not somebody." Elias looked at him. Grady's eyes remained fixed on the storm above them. "I was afraid of this." Another silence passed between them while wind howled across the mountain. Finally, Elias asked the question slowly. "Who are we following?" Samuel Grady tightened his grip on the lantern handle. Firelight reflected in his tired old eyes as he answered in almost a whisper. "A man who should have died 10 years ago." Wind screamed across Copper Pass all through the afternoon, while Elias Turner followed the lone set of tracks higher into the mountains. Snow reached nearly to his knees now, heavy and sharp against his boots, but the trail ahead remained fresh enough to follow. Whoever walked these ridges knew exactly where they were going. Samuel Grady moved beside Elias through the storm, carrying the old lantern low against the wind. Behind them, the stranded railroad men stayed hidden inside the mine tunnel, waiting for either rescue or disaster to find them first. "You still have not told me his name," Elias said quietly as they climbed. Grady remained silent for several seconds. Snow drifted across his shoulders while the old scout kept his eyes on the trail ahead. Wade Mercer, he finally answered. Elias stopped walking. Just for a second. Barely noticeable. But the mountain seemed quieter afterward somehow. Mercer is dead, Elias said. Grady shook his head slowly. That is what we believe. The name dragged old memories from deep places Elias rarely touched anymore. Campfires under army canvas. Cavalry horses lined against frozen ridges. Men younger then. Better men maybe. Wade Mercer had once ridden beside them during the Colorado campaigns years ago. Smart. Fearless. Dangerous in the way some men became when they stopped believing rules applied to them. Last I heard, Elias said carefully, he disappeared after Red Hollow. Grady's face hardened at the mention of that place. Disappeared after stealing payroll from his own regiment. Snow cracked softly beneath their boots while they climbed through narrow pine trails. Elias remembered now. Not the full details. Just pieces. A burned camp. Missing soldiers. Gold gone overnight. And Mercer vanishing into the mountains before sunrise. Nobody ever found his body. Back then, Elias had still believed every man could be saved if somebody reached him in time. The war taught him otherwise. You think he found Whitmore's shipment? Elias asked. I know he did. Grady pointed ahead toward a ridge barely visible through the fog. Mercer knows these mountains better than most maps. Elias studied the tracks again carefully. One man carrying weight now. Deeper prints. Slower movement uphill. Gold. If he took the payroll, why stay near the pass? Grady gave a tired old smile at that. Because storms make men greedy and foolish. Wade never trusted easy escapes. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying faint smoke through the snow. Elias lifted his head immediately. Campfire. Nearby. Both men crouched low instinctively beside the ridge, while Grady shielded the lantern light beneath his coat. A small cabin slowly emerged through the storm 50 yards uphill near the cliff edge. Old trapper shack from mining days by the look of it. Smoke curled from the chimney into gray sky. Elias narrowed his eyes. One horse tied outside. Dark bay gelding. Army saddle. Old but maintained carefully. Mercer, Grady whispered. The two men remained hidden beside the ridge while snow drifted around them. Elias studied the cabin quietly. No movement at the windows. No guards. Too quiet again. That same dangerous stillness the mountains kept showing him since arriving. Something feels wrong, he murmured. Grady nodded once. Always did around him. Then Elias noticed another detail near the cabin porch. Wooden crates stacked beneath a tarp. Railroad markings burned into the sides. Whitmore payroll shipment. They found it. Relief should have come then. Enough gold to save Blackwater. Enough money to keep families fed through winter. But instead, unease settled deeper inside Elias's chest. Because Mercer had not run. He stayed. Men who planned on escaping did not sit calmly inside mountain cabins during avalanches. They prepared for something else. Then the cabin door opened slowly through the storm. A tall figure stepped onto the porch holding a steaming coffee cup. Older now. Gray at the temples. But unmistakable. Wade Mercer looked directly toward the ridge where Elias hid as though he had sensed them coming hours ago. Even from 50 yards away, his calm expression never changed. He simply raised the coffee cup slightly through the snow and called out in a steady voice that carried strangely clear across the storm. You boys might as well come inside before this mountain buries all three of us alive. The cabin smelled like cedar smoke, wet wool, and black coffee left too long near the fire. Elias Turner stepped inside slowly with Samuel Grady behind him while snow hissed softly against the windows outside. Wade Mercer closed the cabin door against the storm and rested the wooden bar back into place like a man securing himself against the world. Tom had changed him some. More gray in his hair. Lines around the eyes. But the dangerous calm remained exactly the same. The kind that made rooms feel smaller when he entered them. A cast iron stove glowed red near the far wall, warming the tiny cabin enough for melted snow to drip steadily from Elias's coat onto the floorboards. Near the stove sat 3 railroad crates covered by canvas tarps. Payroll gold. Mercer noticed Elias glance toward them and smiled faintly. Still observant. Elias removed his gloves carefully without answering. Grady remained near the door watching Mercer the way old soldiers watched unexploded dynamite. Quiet. Careful. Never fully relaxed. Mercer poured fresh coffee into tin cups and placed one near Elias. Figured you would come looking eventually. Elias stayed standing. You could have left. Could have, Mercer admitted. But storms close trails faster than old age closes joints. He sat beside the stove with slow, deliberate movements, like a man perfectly comfortable with silence. Outside, wind battered the cabin walls hard enough to shake loose snow from the roof. Grady stepped closer to the fire, warming stiff hands. The men at the mine are running out of food, he said. Mercer nodded once. I know. Elias finally spoke. Then why sit on the gold? Mercer looked up at him directly. Because the gold is not the problem. The room went still after that sentence. Fire crackled softly between them. Somewhere outside, the mountain groaned low beneath shifting snow. Mercer leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the stove flames. Blackwater thinks money keeps towns alive, he said quietly. But money only keeps powerful men comfortable. Elias frowned slightly. Railroad workers need that payroll. And Whitmore needs those workers desperate enough to stay loyal. Mercer lifted his coffee slowly. You think that banker built Blackwater out of kindness? Elias said nothing. Deep down, part of him already knew the answer. Mercer studied him carefully now. You still trying to save everybody, Elias? The question landed heavier than it sounded. Grady looked toward the floor. Old memories moved through the cabin like smoke. Elias rested one hand near the stove for warmth. People freezing in that mine did not cause your grudge with Whitmore. Mercer smiled sadly at that. No, but Whitmore caused plenty for men like them. Wind screamed outside again, while snow rattled against the glass windows. Then Mercer reached beside his chair and picked up a folded newspaper clipping yellowed with age. He handed it toward Elias without a word. Elias unfolded it slowly beneath the firelight. Headline from nearly 10 years earlier. Railroad collapse outside Kansas City. Dozens dead after unsafe bridge construction. At the bottom sat a familiar name. Charles Whitmore. Investor. Elias looked up sharply. Mercer's voice stayed calm. That bridge failed because Whitmore cut costs on materials. Grady closed his eyes briefly like he had heard this story too many times already. Mercer continued quietly. My wife was on that train. Silence settled heavy across the cabin. Elias stared at the article while snowstorms battered the mountains outside. Suddenly pieces began fitting together. The disappearance. The years hidden away. The hatred that never cooled. You stole Army payroll after Red Hollow, Elias said slowly. Mercer nodded once. Thought I could ruin men like Whitmore using their own money. He gave a tired laugh without humor. Turns out vengeance is expensive. Firelight flickered across his face, revealing something Elias never expected to see there. Not rage. Not greed. Exhaustion. Deep old exhaustion from carrying bitterness too many years. Then Mercer looked directly at Elias again. Funny thing is, after all this time, you are still the only man I ever knew who would ride into a blizzard just to save strangers. Elias remained silent. Mercer glanced toward the covered gold crates beside the stove. That is why I stayed. Another crack thundered through the mountains suddenly, louder than before. The cabin shook hard enough to rattle tin cups off the table. Snow dropped from the ceiling beams overhead. All three men looked toward the window instantly. Then came the sound none of them wanted to hear. A deep rolling roar somewhere above the ridge. The avalanche had finally broken loose. The roar swallowed the mountain whole. Snow exploded across the ridge above the cabin like the sky itself had broken apart. Elias Turner lunged toward the window just as white powder slammed against the glass hard enough to crack its spiderweb thin. The entire cabin shook beneath the force. Tin cups crashed onto the floor. One of the payroll crates slid sideways near the stove. Outside, trees vanished beneath rolling waves of snow moving faster than any horse could outrun. Move, Samuel Grady shouted. Elias grabbed the nearest support beam while Mercer threw his shoulder against the cabin door to keep it from bursting inward under the pressure outside. The avalanche thundered past for nearly 30 seconds. Long enough for every man inside to understand how small human beings really were. Then suddenly it stopped. Silence rushed in afterwards so fast it almost hurt the ears. Nobody moved. Snow drifted softly from ceiling beams while the stove rattled quietly beside the wall. Mercer slowly stepped away from the door first. Everybody breathing? He asked. Elias nodded once. Grady exhaled heavily near the stove. Outside, the storm continued, but something had changed. The wind sounded muffled now. Buried. Elias crossed carefully to the cracked window and wiped frost from the glass with his sleeve. White. Nothing but white. Snow packed nearly to the roofline outside the cabin. "We are trapped," Grady murmured behind him. Mercer stared at the blocked doorway silently for several seconds before giving a small, humorless laugh. "Mountain finally made the decision for us." Elias remained focused on the window. Then his expression hardened slightly. "The mine." Grady looked up sharply. Every railroad worker still sheltered lower on the ridge inside the old silver tunnel. If the avalanche reached that side of the mountain, Elias grabbed his coat instantly. Mercer stepped into his path. "You cannot go out there now. They are buried if that slide crossed the lower ridge. And you will join them." Elias met Mercer's eyes calmly. "Maybe." Mercer stared at him in disbelief. "You still willing to die for strangers after everything this world has done to you?" The question hung heavy in the warm cabin air. Elias tightened his gloves slowly. "World does not decide what kind of man I become." Silence followed. Deep silence. The kind that leaves marks on people. Grady looked down at the floorboards quietly. Mercer's jaw tightened for the first time since Elias arrived. Not anger. Something closer to shame. Then Elias reached beside the stove and lifted one of the payroll crates with both hands. Heavy enough to strain his shoulders immediately. Mercer frowned. "What are you doing?" Elias set the crate near the blocked door. "If we clear enough snow to get outside, the gold goes back with us." Mercer laughed softly under his breath. Even now, Elias looked at him steadily. Men in Blackwater need wages before winter. Mercer studied the cowboy in silence while snow hissed against the cabin roof overhead. Finally, he crossed the room without another word, picked up the second crate himself, and carried it beside the first. Grady smiled faintly watching them. "About time you remembered who you used to be, Wade." Mercer ignored the comment. Together, the three men forced open the cabin door inch by inch against packed snow outside. Freezing air rushed inward instantly, carrying ice crystals sharp enough to sting exposed skin. The avalanche had buried half the cabin beneath drifts nearly 8 feet deep. Darkness already crept across the mountains as daylight faded behind thick storm clouds. Elias climbed into the snow first, hauling a rope behind him. Mercer followed, carrying supplies, while Grady secured the payroll crates for transport. Every movement felt slow now. Heavy. The mountain had turned into a frozen ocean, trying quietly to drown them all. Then Elias stopped suddenly halfway down the buried ridge. He crouched low near the snowpack, listening carefully. Mercer reached him seconds later. "What is it?" Elias raised one hand for silence. At first there was only wind. Then faintly beneath the snow somewhere downhill came a sound, so weak most men would have missed it entirely. Knocking. 3 slow taps. Pause. Then 2 more. Army distress code. Somebody from the mine was still alive under the avalanche. The knocking came again beneath the snow. 3 slow taps. Pause. Then 2 more. Weak now. Fading. Elias Turner dropped to one knee instantly and pressed his gloved hand against the frozen drift covering the lower ridge. Beneath layers of packed snow and shattered pine branches, somebody was still alive. Wind tore across the mountainside, carrying ice hard enough to sting exposed skin, but Elias barely noticed. "Here," he said sharply. Wade Mercer and Samuel Grady moved beside him at once. All 3 men listened carefully. Silence for several seconds. Then another faint knock answered from somewhere below them. Mercer's face tightened. Mine and trance collapsed. Elias was already digging with both hands. Snow packed hard as stone resisted every movement. Mercer cursed softly and joined him while Grady hacked at the drift using a broken timber board from the buried cabin porch. Time disappeared after that. Just breath. Snow. Ice. Exhaustion. The mountain fighting to keep what it buried. Elias's fingers went numb beneath his gloves within minutes, but he never slowed. He knew the sound trapped men made beneath cave-ins. Every second mattered now. "Ben!" Elias shouted into the snowpack. "You hear me?" A muffled voice answered faintly below. Relief crossed Grady's tired face. Still breathing. Mercer dug harder beside Elias without another word. The former outlaw who once stole army payroll now clawed through freezing snow to save railroad workers he never met. Strange thing about storms. They stripped men down to whatever truth remained underneath everything else. Nearly an hour passed before Elias finally struck wood beneath the drift. "Mine supports." He cleared snow away fast enough to expose a narrow pocket of trapped air beneath the collapsed entrance. "Back up," he ordered. Together, they pulled loose the broken timbers one at a time until cold trapped air burst upward from the tunnel below. Voices echoed immediately from the darkness underneath. "Weak. Panicked. Alive. Easy," Elias called down. One at a time. The first worker crawled free, trembling from cold and exhaustion. Then another. Then Ben Harper, covered in dust and snow, but alive. One by one, the trapped men emerged into the fading daylight, while Grady wrapped blankets around their shoulders near the ridge. Some cried quietly from relief. Others simply sat in silence, staring at the sky like men returned from the grave. Elias kept count carefully. 11 survivors. Then he looked back toward the opening. Thought there were 12. Silence answered him. Ben lowered his eyes slowly. Mr. Collins did not make it after the collapse. Wind moaned across the ridge softly. Nobody spoke for several moments. In the Old West, death usually arrived loud. Gunfire, horses, or fights. But sometimes it came quietly beneath snow while the world kept moving anyway. Elias removed his hat briefly against his chest. Nothing dramatic, just respect. Then Mercer stepped toward the rescued workers, carrying one of the payroll crates across his shoulders. The men stared in confusion as he lowered it carefully beside them. Gold bars rested. Inside, beneath canvas wrapping. Enough money to change lives. Enough to ruin them too. Mercer looked at the crate for a long time before finally speaking. "This belongs to Blackwater." Grady studied him carefully. "You sure?" Mercer gave a tired smile that looked older than the mountains around them. "Spent 10 years trying to punish one rich man." His eyes shifted toward the exhausted railroad workers huddled in blankets nearby. "Turns out I was hurting the wrong people." Elias watched him quietly. No judgment, no speeches, just understanding. Mercer glanced back toward Elias then. "Funny thing, cowboy." He looked out across the storm slowly beginning to clear above Copper Pass. "You rode all the way up here for strangers." Elias adjusted the blanket around Ben Harper's shoulders. "Nobody stays a stranger long in weather like this." The clouds above the mountains finally began to break apart then, thin rays of evening sunlight cutting through storm fog across the ridge. Golden light touched the snow for the first time in days. Down below, far beyond the mountain trails, Blackwater waited without knowing yet that 12 men were alive, and that one poor cowboy had just saved the entire town from collapse. 3 days later, the people of Blackwater heard bells before they saw horses. Church bells. Slow at first, then louder across the town square as children ran through muddy streets shouting that the mountain riders were coming home. Storekeepers stepped outside carrying aprons still dusted with flour. Railroad workers abandoned half-built tracks near the depot. Even the men inside the saloon drifted toward the windows. Out beyond the southern road, a line of riders slowly emerged through the morning fog beneath pale winter sunlight. 12 railroad men wrapped in blankets rode beside pack horses carrying the recovered payroll crates. At the front rode Elias Turner on his tired gray horse with snow still crusted along the edges of his coat. Samuel Grady rode beside him. Wade Mercer followed farther back, silent as stone. Nobody in town recognized him, but every person recognized the gold crates. Murmurs spread instantly across Main Street. "They found it. Good. Lord, they are alive." The riders entered town slowly beneath complete silence. No cheering, no celebration yet. People simply stared at the men returning from a mountain everybody believed had already buried them forever. Near the bank steps, Charles Whitmore pushed through the crowd still wearing the same black coat from the night Elias left town. Clara stood beside him, gripping her gloves tightly against nervous hands. Noah Whitmore spotted Elias first and nearly broke into a run before his father caught his shoulder gently. Elias dismounted slowly in the center of town. Exhaustion sat heavy behind his eyes now. 3 days without real sleep. Frost still clung to the brim of his hat. One by one, the rescued railroad workers climbed down from their horses while families rushed forward, crying quietly into coats and shoulders. Ben Harper hugged his mother so tightly the poor woman nearly collapsed from relief. Blackwater had expected bodies from the mountains. Instead, Elias brought sons and fathers home alive. Then Mercer and Grady lowered the payroll crates into the mud before the bank. Gold bars gleamed beneath morning light when the lids opened. A stunned hush rolled across the street. Charles Whitmore stared at the recovered shipment like he could barely understand what he was seeing. $50,000 returned. 12 men alive. Contracts saved. Railroad future secured. Everything he feared lost now sat before him covered in mountain snow. Slowly, the banker lifted his eyes toward Elias Turner, the same cowboy he had thrown silver coins at beside the river only days earlier. Elias stood quietly near his horse, rubbing the tired animal's neck with rough, frozen hands. He looked uncomfortable with the tension already settling around him, like a man wishing he were somewhere quieter. Then something happened nobody in Blackwater ever forgot. Charles Whitmore stepped forward into the muddy street and removed his gloves slowly. For a long moment, he simply looked at Elias while cold wind drifted through town, carrying the last smell of winter storms from the mountains. Then the richest man in Texas lowered himself onto one knee in the mud. Complete silence. Swallowed Main Street. Even the horses seemed still. Whitmore bowed his head slightly. "I was wrong about you," he said quietly. Elias said nothing. He never needed many words. Whitmore looked up again, eyes tired in a way money could not fix. "You saved my son." His voice tightened slightly. "Then you saved this town." Elias glanced around at the railroad families, embracing one another beside the recovered gold. At the workers alive because nobody left them behind. Finally, he answered softly. "Men up there saved each other." Whitmore swallowed hard before standing again. Pride had finally loosened its grip on him. Clara stepped forward, next carrying something folded carefully in both hands. The white towel she gave Elias before he rode north into the storm. Clean no longer. Dirt-stained now. Torn along one edge from wrapping frozen hands and wounded men. She offered it back to him gently. "You kept them alive," she whispered. Elias looked at the cloth for a moment before taking it carefully. So did they. Their eyes held there briefly while winter sunlight warmed the muddy street around them. No speeches followed. No music. Just wind moving softly through Blackwater while townspeople watched one poor cowboy stand quietly beside his tired gray horse, holding a worn white towel that somehow weighed more than all the gold in Texas.